So I'm Stacey Ritz. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Pathology and Molecular Medicine, and I'm also the assistant dean for the Honors Health Sciences program. And so in my scholarly work, I actually started my career as a laboratory researcher doing allergy and immunology research and focused on experimental models of asthma and allergic disease and other immunologic diseases. But over the years, my scholarship has really shifted and changed. And at this point, I no longer run a lab. And my scholarship is focused on how can we best incorporate sex and gender related considerations into health research, and especially into health research that is based in the laboratory, because there's certain kinds of particular considerations in that realm that don't apply or that apply differently than if you're working with human subjects or clinical trials or that sort of thing. So that's the overview.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. So yeah, it's perfect because I reached out to you because what we're going to talk about today a little bit is kind of this discourse that's arisen, especially very contentiously online, about gender identity and the inclusion of like diverse and varied gender identities that are maybe outside the binary.
Yeah.
And so, I, like, as a young person online, have come across people who are political commentators who kind of will, like, set traps and kind of try to confuse people online. And I've kind of been grappling with how to, maybe in some small way be prepared, or not to, like, maybe necessarily respond to someone, but to kind of, like, in my own mind, kind of fortify my own knowledge. And so often these arguments are, things related to like biology. So kind of like a biologizing argument of, please, like, define a woman, like, what is a woman? And it's like about, chromosomes, or it's about women's ability to give birth. And that then carries over into like more psychological things. So women are, made to give birth, and therefore there's all these other things about women that are also true. And so if you came across that kind of rhetoric, maybe it could come from two different lenses. So there's kind of maybe the online or someone in person who's kind of has these beliefs. What do you think that you would say, or what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's so funny that we were talking about this afternoon, because literally earlier this afternoon, I was in a conversation with a colleague about a paper that we're writing together, and we were trying to decide exactly what we wanted the paper to be about. And this is basically what we decided the paper to be about. So this is very fresh in my mind. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the question about, like, how do we define sex and gender is not a new question in scholarship, not a new question in society, not a new question in science, but the significance of it and the concepts people bring to it, and particularly the political landscape around it, dimensions around it, shifted and changed a lot over time. And this is a particularly acute, challenging moment around those questions, because of the ways that debates around how do we define sex and gender, how do we define who is a woman and who gets to use what bathroom, who gets to compete in what sports, and who gets to have what marker on their passport is concrete and very threatening for many marginalized folks, and the ways that scientific knowledge about sex and gender is often being deployed and weaponized by people who are not actually scientists and who don't actually care about science, and who don't actually understand the science they think they're talking about. But they're using the authority of science as sort of a rhetorical weapon, even though they don't actually understand. And they're deploying it very insincerely as well. It's not that they're just, like, misunderstanding the science and genuinely trying to make an argument. No, they're using it insincerely and in malignant ways to achieve particular political ends. So I think the questions and the problems around what is sex, what is gender, what is a woman, what is a man, how do we define these things, are real, important, philosophical questions, social questions, scientific questions, and deserve our attention and deserve our very thoughtful approach, and have for that we have been engaging in that for many years.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a particularly challenging moment for that. So that's all preamble. Your question was, how do I handle that when someone, brings that up online? What is a woman?
Yeah.
And one of the examples that you sent me to contemplate ahead of time was exactly that. You're a feminist, you should be able to define what a woman is. Right?
Exactly.
And I actually think that the way that I would respond to that right now is different from what I would have 2 years ago or what I might 5 years from now. But I think right now I would say, I would kind of challenge the premise of the question. For what purposes are we trying to define this question? And actually, from a scientific perspective, a big part of my work in the last few years has been about exactly that. Like, for what purposes? Why are we asking that question? Because why we're asking the question will inform what the most appropriate answer to that question is. So what is a woman? I would say there is no singular definition of what is a woman that is appropriate for all contexts and all questions and all purposes. If you're trying to define what is a woman for the purpose of deciding who gets to compete in women's sports, what matters is different than if you're trying to decide what is a woman for the purposes of social categorization in some other context, or who gets access to certain kinds of healthcare, or how do we design a scientific experiment to try and understand sex and gender related influences. So there's no definition of a woman that is universal for all purposes. I think that's how I would respond to that. I would say, there is no singular universal definition that works for every purpose. So what is the purpose that you're trying to achieve here? And then we can talk about what it might appropriately mean in that context.
I think that that's a great starting point to kind of open up that conversation and interrogate, because as you said, I think oftentimes when people are asking these questions, it's not in good faith. They actually don't have a good handle on the science. And so kind of challenging that, and because I think oftentimes they're speaking to university students, like these media trained people are speaking to university students who are they don't maybe like we as not people who study sex and gender and biology maybe don't have that grasp either. And so it's kind of like exploiting their own vulnerabilities and others in that question.
I mean, so I teach a course on sex, gender, and health for undergrads, and it's open to students across the whole university. So there's science students, and there's arts and science students, and there's economics students I've got in this. So people from lots of different scientific backgrounds. And one of the things that I convey frequently in that course is that what I know as a scientist and as a scholar whose focus is on these kinds of questions about sex and gender and what does it mean, is that if anybody claims that they have the definitive definition of what is a woman or what sex is or what is gender, and they claim that it's simple and straightforward, they are wrong. And they are not actually experts, because if they were experts, they would know that it's not simple and it's not straightforward. So that by itself, somebody claiming to have a simple answer to that question is a signal that they lack expertise.
Good to know. We'll look out for it.
They're claiming expertise. That doesn't mean they have it.
So like one other dimension of this question that we can just touch on briefly, if you have any thoughts about it, is like, as I said, I think that digital algorithms and stuff like that have played a big part in kind of maybe spreading this rhetoric around, because they kind of deal in contention and anger and that kind of thing, and for people to be riled up from either side. And so I was wondering if your approach would change at all, maybe trying to, if you're looking at something online and you see this kind of rhetoric there versus if you're talking to someone in person.
Absolutely.
And like what are your thoughts on the differences between those two?
I mean, and again, it's not even just about the difference between online and in person. I think it is also a decision about, like, is this person coming to the conversation in good faith? Are they actually trying to understand, or are they trying to just score a political point? I think, if you're, regardless of if you're online or in person, like if I'm on social media and I'm deep in a comment section and sort of like, and I've decided it's worth the effort to try and weigh in, which is itself the first question, is it worth it? I think I've often found, especially, it's probably more effective in person, but can be effective in online environments too, is to respond to those kinds of claims with questions, rather than trying to counter the arguments. Is to respond with questions about their premises. What is it that you're actually trying to achieve here? What aspect of this is important to you? Why is this important in this context? And that way it can more organically lead to entertaining some of that complexity, as opposed to just trying to argue back with them. One of the things that we have started talking about in part of our curriculum in health sciences program is in a session that we call discomfort, curiosity, and perspective taking. And the idea there is that when you are in a situation where you're finding yourself sort of emotionally triggered, you find that discomfort for some reason, you're feeling defensive, you're feeling angry, it's very natural to respond defensively and try and convince the other person that they're wrong. And that almost never works for any reason, whether it's trolls online, a comment section with your mom, like it almost never works to try and convince the other person that they're wrong. But it can often be a much more fruitful strategy to respond with curiosity. What's going on? Ask questions. Why is it that we think differently about this? And think about it, not necessarily trying to win the argument or convince the other person that you're right, but thinking about how can we better understand why we don't agree. And that's often more useful. Like, we don't have to agree, but if we understand why we don't agree, we actually have a better framework. So I think that idea of trying to be curious and trying to ask more questions about trying to understand the nature of the disagreement is probably going to be more fruitful online or in person than trying to convince the other person. But again, it also depends on whether that person is actually acting in good faith. And if they're not, it's probably more, you probably just want to walk away.
Effective. No, for sure.
No,
because when I was doing research for this project, it was kind of like the differences between online and in-person interaction were kind of coming up. And in-person interaction, when someone says something, it's kind of like in a conversation, like there's a common ground of the conversation already, and that speech has been uttered into like the arena of the conversation, I guess, and is given legitimacy by that. But online, like someone can kind of say something into the void, and if you never interact with it, no one else might never ever see it. So it definitely that kind of changes your decisions around that, and also maybe sometimes responding to speech can give it legitimacy. So there's times when, as you said, we don't want to like engage in that.
I mean, it's sometimes, in an online environment, for example, the response, it might most usefully be to engage and say, like, this issue is actually a lot more complicated than you're making it out to be, but it doesn't sound like you're actually interested in engaging that complexity, so I'll just leave it at that, so you're marking it, you're naming it, you're saying like you're trying to oversimplify something that is not simple, but not necessarily trying
go
to
into it, the whole mile,
especially if you don't sense that there is actually a true, genuine interest in trying to understand the complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Just to kind of maybe pull it back and finish it off, I just want to touch briefly on like this other trend that I've been seeing that I also shared with you, of kind of just like more minute trends that have to do a little bit with gender essentialism, and especially I think defining girlhood in specific ways, like there's phrases like girl math or I'm just a girl, and they kind of attach certain things to being a woman, so like that's kind of more of less about the biology and a little bit maybe more about the psychological, but
almost
also related
the social,
to the like kind of maybe in some ways indicating or implying that girlhood or womanhood has certain traits attached to it. And I think oftentimes that is not really in bad faith. It's more about just people trying to relate to each other and share their experiences
and poking fun at sort of some norms, and in this case gender norms and gender roles and gender expectations.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to know your thoughts on that, and if you think that plays a part in like our gender discourse, or if it's just kind of good fun. I
mean, sometimes it's good fun.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's totally just in good fun, and is really about playing with and poking and prodding at these stereotypes, because a lot of these things, the girl math phenomena, like that's just poking fun at stereotypes, or it's either poking fun at stereotypes, or it's endorsing and re-entrenching those stereotypes. I think that's, but it either way, it is speaking to stereotypes about gender, stereotypes about what it is, what constitutes girlhood, what constitutes womanhood, what constitutes masculinity. And that it's one of the ways that we discursively evolve and keep engage with the discourses of gender in informal ways. We're not talking about the scholarly literature or anything like that, but this is the landscape of gender that we all operate in. And I think, like, one of the things that I think is important to note, and it's the distinction between gender identity and the larger concept of gender. And I've seen that become kind of muddied in the last 10 years, because I think there has been a lot of attention paid, a lot of important and valuable attention and advocacy and solidarity work and so on to enhance trans visibility and open our collective eyes to a more diverse way of understanding gender identity. And that's very valuable. But I think it has also led to some confusion about gender identity equating to gender, the larger concept. So for me, like, gender identity is an aspect of gender, but it is not itself gender. Gender is a much larger construct of lots of interacting things around gender identity, gender performance, gender norms, gender expectations, gendered relations, institutional gender and power, all of these kinds of things interacting with each other. So I think when we're talking about, a trend like talking about girl math, we're engaging with these questions about the discourses of gender and gender performance and gender norms and expectations of femininity. And it highlights this idea of girl math. Those examples are sort of like about shopping, and tapping into this stereotype of as women as shopping and interested in makeup and all these kinds of hyper feminized norms about femininity and capitalism, for example. So I mean, I think they can be subversive. They can be transgressive and sort of push back against patriarchal norms and sexist stereotypes about men or about women, or they can essentialize and further entrench it. Because I think part of the reason that they appeal to people is that there are a lot of social norms that and tendencies that want to perpetuate an idea that these differerences, these gendered differences, are natural and are unassailable and are not changeable, because that solidifies and perpetuates a status quo around the distributions of power. And so if we believe, if our narratives of gender entrench our belief that there are intractable natural differences between men and women that explain why there's inequality and these kinds of things, that supports the status quo. And so a lot of those narratives around gender essentialist stereotypes perpetuate that further. But they can be used and played with in ways that kind of poke holes in it and I highlight the absurdity of it, like this idea that there's anything natural and biological and genetic about how much, about lying to yourself about how much money you spend on a purse. Like, it's just, it's so ridiculous. We cannot take seriously, I hope we cannot take seriously the idea that is somehow
like,
about our chromosomes or our gonads or anything like that, right?
Like,
but but there are people who would argue that it is.
Yeah.
So I think I'm intrigued by these things. I mean, another related phenomenon that I see a lot, and I actually use in my course a lot, is the gendering of products.
Yeah.
The way that you'll see, tweezers for sale, and here's a pair of tweezers for women and a pair of tweezers for men.
Yeah.
And they are literally can I swear?
Yeah.
They are literally the exact fucking same tweezers.
Yeah.
like
maybe pink or something, yeah.
But one of them is pink.
Yeah.
Or the packaging is pink. The one example I have in mind, they are literally exactly the same tweezers, but the packaging here is pink, but the packaging here is black. And the packaging here emphasizes, that they are finely, refined to get even the tiniest, most delicate hairs. And the text on this one talks about how they're engineered for toughness and durability. And this one costs $14.99 and this one costs $10.99, and they're literally the fucking same thing, right? So it's kind of perpetuating the same idea that somehow we need different tools for taking hair out of our faces. And yet it bursts its own bubble by being literally the same item. But again, I think a lot of this is fed by capitalism, or at least capitalism feeds off of. Capitalism can capitalize off of these kinds of social mythologies and norms around gender, and exploit them for capitalist purposes. So I think a lot of those kinds of essentialist things we see exploited for capitalist purposes, and other forms of the function of power that perpetuates concentration of power in the hands of the privileged.
So maybe the way to look at that a little bit, because I think that something that is also implicated in that a little bit is that often, like, in the aestheticization of girlhood, it's often like a specific type of girl who's like shown. It's like a white upper middle class girl, someone maybe a bit like me as well. But I think that definitely that's a great start that you put out there of just like bursting the bubble of a little bit like, okay, like this is evolutionarily over like hundreds of thousands of years, we grew an innate desire for like Stanley cups and to want to to justify our bad purchases, and that's like what thousands of years of evolution gave us. No, that's a little bit ridiculous. So maybe just starting.
It's much more scientifically speaking. It is much more plausible that is socially created than it is somehow genetic or biological. Like, I mean, even from a scientific perspective, it does not make sense to think that somehow we have a gene that does that.
It's crazy. It's
as opposed to it's cultural. Clearly, it's cultural.
Starting that process kind of within yourself of kind of like laughing at those things, just so that I think that it's important sometimes, because I think that when you're sold this idea of girlhood, sometimes maybe it's easy to become protective of it. And when you become protective of it, it becomes exclusionary. And so just reminding yourself that, like, hey, this is kind of ridiculous. This is not necessarily what being a girl or what my identity is. Sometimes it's fun, but just making sure to interrogate those things for their ridiculousness. I
mean, I think one of the things about gender that makes it so challenging for people to challenge and interrogate is that it feels so central to who we are. And that is also cultural, right? Like, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was touching the microphone.
Don't worry, it's all good.
That this centrality of the idea of gender to our identity is a cultural phenomenon. It is. You can imagine a scenario where a creature does not particularly think of itself as being male or female, as being particularly germane to their day-to-day. I mean, I just think about my cats. My cats do not give a shit about whether they're male or female. It has zero bearing on how they understand themselves. It's not necessarily biological for it to be such a hugely important way of shaping your world. I mean, are there biological aspects of reproduction that shape our experience in certain ways? Sure, of course. The experience of being pregnant and or the experience of sexual relationships with somebody else, does that have a material impact on our life? Sure.
Yeah.
But the idea that has to become such a defining aspect of how we understand who we are in the world and how everyone else treats us about everything that doesn't even have anything to do with pregnancy or sexual intercourse or anything like that. The idea that function should shape everything. What kind of clothes you wear. Why on earth? There's no scientific biological reason why the ability to gestate a baby should mean that I have long hair. There's, or that I should, wear pink, or it's okay for me to wear pink, but it's less okay for someone else. Like, there's no biological plausibility to that. So I don't argue that there is no material basis around thinking about how sex-related, reproductive related differences in our bodies that are the reality of sexual reproduction. I don't deny that can't have any social impact but the idea that it has any impact doesn't require us to think that it should shape our lives so profoundly and completely.
Which it kind of
it
does
doesn't,
often,
but it does.
Yeah.
It does for most people, most of the time, in most cultures.
Yeah.
And that doesn't follow. So I think for me, that's an important distinction. To acknowledge that, yes, there are biological things happening related to sexual reproduction that shape certain parts of our lives in certain ways and shape, have an influence on the ways that our physical bodies exist, are manifested in the world. I don't deny that those are real material elements, but the idea that means society exists in a certain way where that is such a primary definer of how we are in this world, that is a leap that is completely social, completely cultural.
Yeah, especially the question of sex and gender, like you said, because it informs so much of who we are and who we're friends with and how we create relationships. It is, I think, hard for people, even if they want to fight back against those arguments. It's hard to grapple with sometimes. So that's why I think it's so great to talk with someone.
And maybe what I will add, because you just kind of reminded me of something that I thought of before that didn't end up saying, is this idea about gender as being who we are versus thinking about gender as what we do. Because when we think about gender as what we do, but not necessarily like core to how we understand our identity, I think it shifts our relationship to it in a way, as opposed to when we think it's who we are. Like if I take it away from the gender question for a minute and say, if I think, I'm a vegetarian. If I understand that is who I am, and it's central to my identity, that is a different relationship to vegetarianism than if I say I choose to eat vegetarian foods.
Plant-based,
it's not who I am. It's a choice that I make, and it's a behavior that I engage in, and it's something I do. It's not something I am. And I use that example because I think about it for myself. I remember a moment being like, am I a vegetarian as my identity, or is it just a thing that I do? And I've actually concluded it's a thing that I do. It's related to values I hold that I think of as closer to who I am. But it's a behavior
Yeah.
It's things I do rather than who I am as a person. And then I started to translate into that thinking about gender, like how much of what I think of as what it is to enact and embody being a woman, how much of that is really about who I understand myself to be, and how much of that is just about what I do, what I choose to wear, and how I align myself to these cultural norms. So I think that sense of for most of us, I think most of us have a sense of our gender as something about our identity, about who we are, which is partly what makes it so threatening when people start asking questions about poking holes in, like, maybe gender isn't what you think it is, and maybe being a woman is different than you think it is, and so on. And I think if we can at least play with the idea that maybe gender, what changes for us if we think about gender as something we do rather than who we are? Does that make it less threatening to talk about these things? Does that open up certain kinds of possibilities that maybe it's harder to think about when we think of it as central to who we are?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that that's what gets people maybe who wouldn't normally be, or like who would come to a conversation in good faith, but who like think that there's kind of some kind of female experience that other people can't be let into because like it's specific only to those who are, you know, born a certain way as biological women, right? Where it's like, okay, like let's shift that. There's also not really like a hegemonic female experience, like what you're thinking about it as. It's like, your own, right?
Well, like a lot of these people who want to make this about what is a woman, and you know, they're setting a trap to be, and you know, like for people who are trying to set that trap in a, you know, insincere way, you know, often they'll talk about, like, you know, like the ability to become pregnant and gestate a child. That's what defines a woman biologically. But it's like that all of those fall apart very quickly, scientifically fall apart very quickly. Because if that's what defines being a woman, well, there are lots of people who can't become pregnant, or can't gestate a child for lots of reasons, who that person who's laying that trap would absolutely say, well, yes, that person is a woman.
Yes.
And so what they actually are, you can start tearing apart, and they're saying, well, if a woman is someone who has a uterus, well, what happens about someone who's had a hysterectomy? Are they a woman? Well, yes, they are a woman. So, or most of those dudes would say, well, yes, they're still a woman because they had a uterus. Well, what if they never had a uterus, but everything, you know, they were just born without one? Like, what if they, you know, what if it's X chromosome? Like, they all fall apart because none of those singular markers are actually sufficient to fulfill the argument they're trying to make. So they all fall apart. And I guess so that what it comes back to, that is like, what is the purpose for which you're trying to answer that question? If the purpose for which you're trying to answer that question is like, okay, it's important to know who's a woman because we are trying to know who we should vaccinate against, you know, HPV. You know, I mean, everyone should be vaccinated against HPV, but like, it's important to know who needs a pap smear. That's a better example. It's important to know who needs a pap smear.
Okay.
And so we need to know who's a woman. Well, then it's like, okay, for that purpose, what you actually need to know is if someone has a cervix. It doesn't actually matter whether you call that person a woman or a man. You actually just need to know that they need a cervix. In another case, it might be like, we need to know who's a woman so we can know about protecting someone from exposure to potential teratogens that could cause birth defects and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so what you actually need to know is who is somebody who might be vulnerable to exposure to teratogens. Again, whether you call them a woman or not doesn't actually matter. You just need to identify people who could potentially become pregnant. And there are lots of people who can't become pregnant because they don't have a uterus, because they never had a uterus, because they were born with, you know, but there are also other people who can't become pregnant for other reasons. You know, they have used some form of contraceptive that means that it's impossible for them to become pregnant, or they have some other kind of difference of sexual development that means they'll never become pregnant, or their, you know, their gender identity is male, but their gender identity is female, but they don't have ovaries or whatever. Like there are lots of reasons. So it doesn't actually matter whether you're not actually talking about women. You're talking about people with a certain kind of capacity, which that label doesn't matter.
Yeah, and so
it all falls apart.
Everything.
So you can actually make it all fall apart if you kind of push back on what's the purpose for you asking this question. And if it's a question about like, we need to know who's a woman for social reasons, well, for social reasons, then the answer is simply whoever says they're a woman is a woman. Whoever feels they're a woman is a woman.
Yeah.
If it's like,
yeah,
if you don't feel that's legitimate, then why is that not legitimate for your purpose? What is it that you're afraid of?
Yeah.
What's the bad thing that could happen?
And
right?
and I think often like they do use like women's protection and things like that for that purpose. And
it's so insincere. It's so bad faith. It's so disingenuous, because people who make that argument that they're asking that question to protect women, this question about who uses what bathroom and who's in what sport and who's allowed in what change room, like as a question of safety for women. It's so disingenuous, because the science, the data, the evidence is very clear that the danger to women in those kinds of situations that they're talking about is not coming from trans folks. The danger is always cis men. And so there's no evidence to support a claim that trans women are a risk to cis women.
Not at all.
Not at all.
No, I saw this comedian who made a joke about it. He was like, yeah, like there's all these men out there who just, they want to go into the women's bathrooms and like terrorize women. Yeah. But they can't because they're just not allowed in there. But it's just ridiculous.
Well, actually, that concept. There are men who do that.
Yeah.
And they're
not necessarily stopped by any like it's not about signage or anything like that.
I am not aware of any instance ever where someone has taken on the identity of is a trans woman who has done that, has embodied, taken on that identity, and then harmed women in a bathroom.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any time that has ever happened.
It's another section place where you kind of have to like pull out the ridiculousness. Yeah. In the same way. Yeah. That's what we talked about before. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. I think we might stop there.
Okay. Fair.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
It's been a great conversation, and like I'm
having fun. That's why I don't want to stop.
I'm glad that you're having fun. But yeah, just